Hey guys, we're on our last lesson for chapter 5 today, and you should be starting on page 130 up by this heading that says Speciation and Extinction Determine Biodiversity. Okay, so our first sticky note, we're going to start with allopatric versus sympatric speciation. Now, we know that we're having microevolution occurring all the time due to, like the examples that they give here are agricultural crops, which is an intentional microevolution. And then we also have the unintentional evolution of drug-resistant bacteria in hospitals, which is really kind of a huge issue right now. Things like MRSA and hospital infections that are making it difficult to treat patients in hospitals where these bacteria live. All right, so we know that microevolution can eventually lead to macroevolution, which is the creation of a new species or speciation. Right, now there's two ways that speciation can occur. All right, so we have a change in geographic location or geographic isolation, and then we also have reproductive isolation. So let's talk about how those two things can happen. All right, so first we have geographic isolation, where two populations are physically separated from one another. So initially it's the same species that are physically separated. For example, maybe a bunch of seagulls go and colonize a new island, okay? Or maybe one lake kind of dries up, or some land builds up in the middle of it and it becomes two lakes. Or sometimes we can have some floods or volcanic eruption or something like that that moves water and ends up flooding land, okay? So that can make populations geographically isolated, okay? So individually distinct from one another. Another way is that sometimes this geographic isolation then leads to something called reproductive isolation. So after probably hundreds of years, the two populations that were once the same population are now too different to breed. Okay, so they've evolved over time, and now their genomes are too different to actually reproduce effectively. So this requires geologic isolation and a lot of time. Okay, so this isn't going to happen in 1 or 2 generations. It's going to take probably 100 generations for this reproductive isolation to happen. Okay, so now once we get to the point where the two populations cannot reproduce with each other anymore, that's when we now officially have two different species. So there is a name for those: allopatric speciation and sympatric speciation. Okay, so allopatric is this geographic isolation idea. Darwin's finches is an example of this allopatric speciation because they kind of they originated in one population and then they were different geographically based on what they like to eat. So we're going to look at their phylogeny here in a second. So keep Darwin's finches in mind when you think about allopatric speciation. Allopatric speciation is the most common way to generate new species, and so that's what happens most often. Now there's this other thing called sympatric speciation, okay, and that's what happens when they undergo this thing called polyploidy. Okay, polyploidy. So poly means lots, okay, and ploidy means chromosomes. Okay, so it should be like diploid or haploid or something like that. That's when we're talking about genetics. Okay, so this is what happens when we increase the number of chromosomes in an organism. Okay, so most organisms are diploid, which means they have 2 sets of chromosomes. We are diploid. Okay, we have 2 sets, which is why when we have 3 sets of a chromosome, like what happens when in Down syndrome, that's polyploidy. Okay, of just chromosome 21 or chromosome 7. There's a trisomy disorder that there's more than one chromosome or more than 2 chromosomes at chromosome 7 and then chromosome 21, I think. So, but most of us are diploid, okay? Now, polyploidy organisms, like let's say you have 3 chromosomes all through your whole genome, okay, it's not 1 or 2, it's all of them have 3 or all of them have 4, they cannot mate with diploid, okay? Now, this mostly happens in plants, okay? It usually increases the plant size and increases the fruit size. And so normally we do that on purpose. Okay, so some examples here are, so plant breeders do it a lot. There's also some species of snails and salamanders, it says. 15% of all flowering plant species. And agricultural crops like bananas, strawberries, and wheat. Okay, so let's look at a picture of that real quick. Okay, so over here, figure 515. This is an example of sympatric speciation. Okay, so what they do is on purpose, they increase the number of chromosomes. So the ancestor wheat only has 2 chromosomes, or 2 sets of chromosomes. This wheat is used to make pasta, and it has 4 sets of every chromosome. And then this last one is the most common one that we use for bread, and it has 6 sets of every chromosome. So 2, 4, 6 means different species. Okay? So they all are all wheat, okay, they are all in the same family, but they are different species, completely different species because they have a different number of chromosomes. Okay, up here we have our Darwin's finches, okay, and this is our example of allopatric speciation. Okay, so the original common ancestor colonized the Galapagos Island, and then we have insect eaters, so these guys broke off and they still eat insects. Then we have insect eaters, okay, that live in trees, and we have one species here that likes to eat flower buds. Then we have over here we have an even more diverse group that eats seeds and cactus flowers. So all of these individual species has evolved through allopatric speciation because they live in different places because of what they eat. Alright? And then here there's a really good example of allopatric speciation in a field of mice. So they originally lived all together. All of a sudden a river comes due to probably flooding or something like that, and separates these species, or separates this population from one population to now 2. And mice are not very strong swimmers, so they're not really going to cross the water. Okay? Over many generations, each population evolves independently. So if you notice, this population ends up being predominantly black mice, and this population ends up being predominantly white mice. And there might be a lot of different reasons for that, or it might be just random processes due to genetic drift or something like that, but they each evolve independently from one another. Okay? Eventually the 2 populations become genetically distinct. Okay, so now this one is completely white and this one is completely black. And then later, even if the river dries up and the 2 populations come into contact, they may no longer be able to interbreed. So even if the river dries up and the mice are like, hey guys, haven't seen you in a couple million years, they probably won't be able to breed with one another because now they are too genetically different. Okay? Alright, now let's talk about the pace of evolution. So what is going to be influencing how fast things evolve? Okay, so I think we have 4 things that affect the pace of evolution. So one of those things, first thing, is the rate of environmental change. So if the environment is changing slowly, okay, so slow change means that they're going to have more time to adapt. Okay, so the organisms that live in that environment are going to have more time to adapt. However, if there's a sudden change, most likely there's going to be a huge wipeout or die-off of organisms that live in that environment because evolution is an extremely slow process. Okay, so these graphs here are the same as on figure 5.17. So on the y-axis we have rate of environmental change from low to high, and here we have the ability to adapt from low to high. So we can see that if the change is fast, we have a low ability to adapt. If the change is slow, we have a high ability to adapt. Okay? Next we have genetic variation. So if we have a high amount of genetic variation or genetic diversity in our population, then we have a higher number of phenotypes, and we have a faster rate of evolution by natural selection. Okay? On the flip side of that, if we have less genetic variation, that means that there is a less chance for the species to adapt to changing conditions. So it's kind of like with the bananas, like I told you guys about the other day. Because bananas are almost genetically identical, there is very low genetic diversity, so if a disease comes along, they're not going to be able to adapt because there's not enough phenotypes that might have a resistance to these different kind of diseases. They're all the same. So lesser ability to adapt with low generation, high ability to adapt with high genetic variation. Okay. All right, number 3, we have population size. Okay, so the lower the population size, okay, when that happens, we have mutations and adaptations that start quickly. Okay, because if it's a small population and one mutation comes by, it's going to spread among the population really, really fast. However, if we have a large population size, the mutation is going to spread pretty slowly. Now, the mutation can be beneficial, and it's good if it spreads fast, but if it's detrimental and it spreads fast, then your whole population is wiped out. Okay, so if a beneficial mutation occurs, it can spread more rapidly in a small population than in a large population. Okay, so sometimes that's going to be good and sometimes that's going to be bad. Our last factor that determines the pace of evolution is generation time. Okay, so how long does it take from one generation to another? Humans, it's about 20 years. Okay, so we have long generation time, especially compared to like an insect. Okay, so because we have such a long generation time, we have slow evolution. Okay, now something with a short generation time, like a bug or a fly, that's going to have fast evolution. And actually, fruit flies are one of scientists' favorite species to track evolution and the passing on of traits because their generation time is so fast. Okay, so if generation time is long, our ability to adapt is short. If generation time is short, then our ability to adapt is high. Okay, so that's what all of those graphs mean. All right, now, how are humans influencing evolution? Mostly by artificial selection. Okay, an example that I used here is the commercial harvesting. Okay, and that's not really that we're artificially selecting when we are fishing out in the ocean, but this concept of commercial fishing, like for example our cod, the fishermen are going to target the largest fish because they are going to want to sell them for the most money. So vicariously through that, we are actually removing the large fish genes from the population. So if we keep removing all the largest fish, especially if they don't have a chance to reproduce first, then we're removing all of those genes that are making those fish grow. So eventually, they're going to all be little. Okay, and I've told students before that tuna is also a large industry as far as commercial fishing, and so eventually your tuna, your little packet of tuna is probably going to cost like $10 or $20. Okay, right now it doesn't cost hardly anything at all, But if we have a shortage of fish, that price is going to increase really fast. Okay, another thing that humans do to influence evolution is genetically modified organisms, or GMOs. Okay, and you've probably heard this at the grocery store or on the news. GMOs is a big thing, okay, but most people don't understand what it means. Okay, and it's actually when humans copy genes from one organism and put it into another. For example, our BT corn actually has an insecticide bacteria in it, or a part of an insecticide bacteria in its genome. So it's naturally, well, not naturally because we made it happen, but it is now genetically modified so that it has an insecticide, so that we don't have to put insecticides on this corn. It is just, quote unquote, naturally resistant to insects. Okay, and most of the food that you eat now from the grocery store is genetically modified, because we want, big, pretty apples. Like, we don't want to eat natural apples from a tree. And a lot of people have a problem with GMOs, mostly because they are not educated on them. My opinion is that if we have people that are starving in the world and we can genetically modify food so that it's more cheap and more plentiful for the people of the world, so people aren't starving, then why not? Like, that's not, killing anyone. It's not, there's been no data that's supportive that it's bad for you. So until that happens, I'm going to say I am pro GMO. Alright, so next let's talk about evolution shapes ecological niches and determines species distributions. Okay, so every species has its favorite environment, okay, and that's where it's called the range of tolerance. Okay, so the range of tolerance is the limits to the conditions a species can tolerate. Now that can be due to either abiotic factors or biotic factors. So some abiotic factors that might determine where something can live is the pH, especially if it's aquatic, temperature, water, and sunlight. Okay, so if you think of like a polar bear, it needs low temperature, it needs water, it needs ice. Okay, and if you're a plant, you're going to need sunlight, of course. Biotic factors might be competitors, predators, or disease. Those things might influence your range of tolerance. Okay, now I drew this graph. It's a reproduction of figure 518. Okay, because it's kind of a bell curve. So there's low survival at the extreme ends of this environment, and then this is the optimal survival area. So that's called the fundamental niche, which is the ideal conditions for a species. Now that's going to be different for every single species out there. Okay, the fundamental niche for a polar bear is going to be the Arctic, with enough ice to take rests and enough food to sustain throughout the winter. Okay, but if you are like a pine tree, then your fundamental niche is going to be good soil, a decent amount of rain, and access to sunlight. Okay, so when you think about niches, you need to understand that there's going to be a lot of differences between species. Okay, now there's a couple of different niches that we think about. So we have the fundamental niche, which is the best. The realized niche is the range of biotic and abiotic conditions where a species actually lives. So not every species is going to be able to live in its ideal situation. So not every species, every organism is going to be able to live in this fundamental niche area. Okay, but they can live out in these shaded areas, which are going to classify as the realized niche. Okay, where can they survive and grow and still pass on their genes? Okay, and that's another word for their distribution. So where are they actually located? You guys did a distribution map for all of your biomes. Okay, so these are the areas of the world where a species lives. Now some species have a wide range distribution, and some species have a very narrow range of distribution. So this wide range organisms, they're called niche generalists. okay, because they are much more adaptable to an environment, okay. And so an example of a generalist from the book is going to be the meadow spittlebug. Okay, they have a broad diet and a wide habitat preference. Okay, so they're pictured down here. Okay, here's our spittlebug. Okay, they can eat lots of different things. Okay, and they can live in lots of different places. So they're going to be niche generalists. Okay, on the other side of that, we have our niche specialist, like our friend over here, the skeletonizing leaf beetle. Okay, and they're actually more vulnerable to environmental change and extinction. Okay, so they're very, very picky. They have a very narrow diet. They can only eat one kind of leaf. Okay, and they have a highly specific habitat preferences. So you can think of these people as, or these organisms as, high maintenance, low maintenance, okay, specialists, generalists. All right? There's also a YouTube video if you'd like to see some more examples. All right, we got a couple more left today. So how does environmental change affect species distribution? So we have a few pieces of evidence from mostly fossilized evidence from the history of species distribution. One of the studies that we did, or by we I mean scientists did, is the changes in tree species distribution over time. Okay, and so this is this graph up here. Okay, so they have looked at a lot of different fossils and things like that and the ice sheets, okay, from 18,000 years ago until now. So how does this environmental change in northern United States and Canada influence the amount of species and the abundance of species in these given areas? Okay, so we have our evidence from sediment layers and carbon dating. Okay, carbon dating is where you take and you decide how much carbon, or you measure how much carbon is in a sample, and then you can use that to determine the half-life. We'll talk about that when we talk about nuclear power. Okay, and our sediment layers are both in rocks and in water, okay, because there's definitely some water up here. Our example is that red pines love the cold. Okay, so we've seen them move north as global temperatures increase. Okay, loblolly pine likes temperate areas. Okay, so they're moving north too. Now, humans change the environments, which leads to changes in species distribution. So as we have kind of seen, the ice sheet moves, okay, then the pine comes with it, then the spruce comes with it. Okay, so as these areas down here are warming up, the species distribution is moving north, moving from over here, which is like Kentucky, all the way up to almost exclusively in Canada. Okay, so same thing with almost all of these species, is that they like the cold, so they're going to be moving up towards where the cold areas are. Okay, so as the environments change, the species distribution are going to change. Now that environmental change can be natural, or it can be done by humans. So if we're cutting down things or diverting rivers or damming rivers or whatever we're doing, that's going to end up changing the species distributions over time. Okay. Now, environmental changes and species extinctions. If there's no favorable environment to move to, different organisms will become extinct, okay? And that's what we're worried about right now with the polar bears, is that if they don't have anywhere to go, then they're going to go extinct, okay? Another way that extinction can happen is that if a competition with inhabitants in a new area. So if our pine trees are moving north, there's probably already a bunch of trees there, so they're going to have to compete with the trees that were already there, Okay, hopefully be able to find a place to live that has enough water and sunlight. Okay, because you might not think that trees have to compete with each other, but they definitely do for resources. Okay. And the last one is going to be that environmental change occurs too rapidly to evolve, and that's what we think happened with the dinosaurs, is that something like an asteroid hit and they couldn't evolve fast enough to deal with the changes in the environment. Okay? Alright, so last sticky note. Hopefully we know what fossils are. They're going to be the remains of dead organisms that's preserved in rocks. Okay, and after hundreds of millions of years, they turn into fossil fuels, which is why they're called fossil fuels, because coal, oil, and natural gas all come from organic matter that's been dead for millions of years. Okay, all of these fossils are going to be buried in sediment layers. The oldest is on the bottom, so as you go, if you dug like 20 feet in the ground, you'd probably find something that died a few years ago. Okay, but if you go hundreds of feet down, you're probably going to find some dinosaurs from millions of years ago. All right, we also have this thing called mass extinction. Okay, we have 5 so far, and that's where the large number of species go extinct in a short amount of time. Okay, the dinosaurs are our best known extinction, and right now we are in what we think is becoming a 6th mass extinction, and that's being caused by humans. Okay, so we're going to do a study on that a little bit later this week, but if we look at this timeline, you can see the number of genera, which is kind of the number of species, where we see it go up and then drop significantly. Okay, go up, go up, go up, drop significantly. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 drops. Okay, 251 million years ago. This was the biggest one, so if you can see that there's hardly any species left at this time. Okay, this was the biggest one. This one is the one with the dinosaurs. Okay, and here we are right now, but what we're trying to figure out is if humans are actually causing this last mass extinction, okay, due to the changes that we have made to the Earth's atmosphere, to the water, and all kinds of things. So what's interesting is that the recovery of these, the recovery time of these mass extinction has taken about 10 million years, okay? And that's a ridiculous amount of time when you think about the human lifespan. This would be like 500,000 generations, okay? Most of the people in the world right now are kind of having a debate, usually among like environmental scientists and politicians and things like that, to figure out like how can we put a number on this so that people can understand that this is an issue and it might be a crisis, and how do we reduce these human impacts on the extinction rate. Okay, so what can we do to lessen our impact on the world? Okay, it's kind of the moral of this class. So think about some extinctions, and we're going to study some of them next week. All right, see you tomorrow.